Officer James Morrison had been having a good day until the sleek black Range Rover caught his eye. Too nice for this neighborhood, he thought, watching it glide past well-kept but modest homes of Cedar Heights. The area had been experiencing a string of high-end car thefts lately, at least, that's what he'd tell his sergeant later when asked why he'd run the plates before even pulling the car over. The registration came back clean. Dr. Michelle Anderson. Something about the name nagged at him, but Morrison brushed it aside. He'd been on the force for 8 years, operated on instinct, and his instinct told him something wasn't right about a vehicle like that in this part of town at this hour. He flipped on his lights, already rehearsing the practiced script he'd use. The Range Rover pulled over with practiced precision, and Morrison noticed the Riverside Memorial Hospital Emergency Department staff parking tag hanging from the rearview mirror. Still, he'd come this far. Besides, he'd learned long ago that credentials could be faked. What he hadn't learned, despite his 8 years on the force, was that some habits, like judging a driver by their car and neighborhood, could lead to consequences far beyond a routine traffic stop. And in the next 15 minutes, Officer James Morrison would discover exactly how high those consequences could reach in the Riverside Police Department's chain of command. Morrison approached the driver's side window with his flashlight held high, its beam cutting through the light drizzle that had started to fall. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a black woman in navy blue scrubs beneath a white doctor's coat. Her hands were already positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a detail that should have put him at ease but somehow made him more suspicious. "License and registration," he demanded, skipping the customary greeting. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then the car's interior, lingering on the designer bag in the passenger seat and the stack of medical files behind it. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" Her voice was calm, measured, with the kind of quiet authority that made Morrison's jaw clench. "License and registration first, ma'am," he repeated, emphasizing the ma'am with just enough edge to make it sound less than respectful. "We can discuss the reason after you comply with my request." She maintained eye contact as she slowly reached for her purse. "I'm going to get my wallet now, officer." The deliberate way she narrated her movements made Morrison's face flush, as if he needed the reminder about proper procedure. The license she handed over was pristine, obviously new. Morrison studied it longer than necessary, shining his light over every detail while rain dripped from his collar. "Dr. Michelle Anderson," the ID confirmed. The address listed was in Riverside Heights, the affluent side of town. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Excuse me?" The composure in her voice wavered slightly. "Officer, I've provided my identification, and I'm still waiting to hear why I was stopped." Morrison's hand shifted to rest on his holster. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you a lawful order, you need to comply. Step out of the vehicle now." "I'm going to call my husband," she said, reaching slowly for her phone. Morrison's voice hardened. "Ma'am, hands where I can see them. Exit the vehicle immediately. My husband needs to know where I am and what's happening." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes flickered to his name badge. "Officer Morrison, I'm not comfortable stepping out until he's aware of the situation." "Last warning," Morrison said, unclipping his holster strap. "Exit the vehicle, or I'll have to." The phone in her hand lit up, and Morrison caught a glimpse of the contact name as she pressed dial, Robert Anderson, home. Something finally clicked in his mind about that name, about the nagging familiarity he'd felt earlier, but before he could process it fully, a deep voice answered on speakerphone. "Michelle? Everything okay, honey? You're late." "Robert, this is Dr. Michelle Anderson, your wife," she spoke clearly into the phone, her eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "I'm currently being detained by one of your officers on Cedar Heights Road. Officer James Morrison has ordered me out of my vehicle without explaining why I was stopped." The silence that followed felt like a vacuum, sucking all the air out of the space between them. Morrison's hand fell away from his holster as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Chief Robert Anderson. Dr. Michelle Anderson. The connection he should have made earlier hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Jim? Is that you?" The chief's voice had transformed from concerned husband to commanding officer in an instant. What's your location? Morrison's throat went dry. Sir, I asked for your location, Officer Morrison. Each word was carved from ice. Cedar Heights Road, just east of Maple Street, sir. Morrison's voice had lost all its previous authority, shrinking into something small and uncertain. Stay exactly where you are. Keep your body camera on. A brief pause. Michelle, honey, are you all right? I'm fine, Robert, she replied, still maintaining that remarkable composure, though there was a slight tremor in her voice now. Just getting tired of these routine stops. The rain continued to fall, but Morrison barely noticed it anymore. His mind was racing through every interaction he'd had with Chief Anderson over the past 3 years. The chief's passionate speeches about community policing. The mandatory diversity training he'd dismissed as political correctness. The framed photo on the chief's desk that he'd walked past 100 times without really seeing, the chief and his wife at their wedding. Officer Morrison. Dr. Anderson's voice cut through his spiral of thoughts. She was still sitting perfectly straight, hands on the wheel, but there was something different in her expression now. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep, weary knowledge. Would you like to explain why you pulled me over? The sound of approaching sirens cut through the rain before he could answer. Red and blue lights appeared at both ends of the street. The chief must have called for backup. As the vehicles drew closer, Morrison realized with growing dread that he recognized one of them. The chief's car. He'd have to explain himself. Not just to his commanding officer, but to a husband who'd entrusted his officers to serve and protect everyone in this community, including his own family. And Morrison knew, with crushing certainty, that he had no explanation that would suffice. Chief Robert Anderson emerged from his vehicle like an approaching storm. Even in civilian clothes, he'd clearly been at home when he got the call. He carried an authority that made Morrison instinctively step back from Dr. Anderson's car. The chief's face was a mask of controlled fury as he approached, flanked by 2 sergeants who'd arrived in the other patrol cars. Michelle, the chief said softly, his eyes never leaving Morrison as he reached his wife's car. Are you okay? I am, she replied, finally letting her hands fall from the steering wheel. But I want this documented. All of it. The chief nodded once, then turned to Morrison. Your body camera functioning, officer? Yes, sir. Morrison's voice sounded distant to his own ears. Good. Because you're going to need that footage. The chief's voice was eerily calm. Sergeant Hayes, please escort Dr. Anderson home. I'll be there shortly. He touched his wife's hand briefly through the window, a gentle gesture that seemed to carry an entire conversation's worth of meaning. As Hayes led Dr. Anderson's vehicle away with an escort, the chief turned his full attention to Morrison. The other sergeant maintained a respectful distance, close enough to witness but far enough to give them privacy. 8 years on the force, Morrison, the chief began, his voice barely above a whisper. 8 years. I've watched you work. Defended your record. Believed you when you said there was no bias in your stops. He took a step closer. So tell me, what was suspicious about my wife's vehicle tonight? Morrison's mouth felt like sandpaper. Sir, Choose your next words very carefully, officer. The chief's eyes bored into him. Because I've just spent the last 6 months reviewing traffic stop data in this precinct. Your data, specifically. Do you know what I found? The rain had stopped, but Morrison felt cold sweat running down his back. He knew exactly what the chief would have found, the pattern he'd always denied existed, even to himself. Black drivers are 4 times more likely to be stopped by you than white drivers in the same areas, the chief continued. 7 times more likely to be asked to exit their vehicles. And now I find you've pulled over my wife, a respected emergency room doctor coming home from a 12-hour shift, with your hand on your weapon. I was following protocol, Morrison began. Protocol? The chief's voice cracked like a whip. Was it protocol that made you run her plates before any traffic violation? Protocol that made you escalate a routine stop? Or was it something else, Officer Morrison? Each question landed like a physical blow. Morrison had no answers that wouldn't damn him further. Here's what's going to happen, the chief said, his voice dropping even lower. You're going to return to the station and write a detailed report of this stop. Every decision. Every action. Every word. Then you're going to go home on administrative leave while I decide whether there's still a place for you on this force. He stepped even closer, close enough that only Morrison could hear his next words. And if you're thinking this is personal because she's my wife, you're wrong. This is personal because she's a human being who deserved better from someone wearing that badge. The same as every other person you've profiled during your 8 years. I just happened to be in a position to witness it firsthand tonight. The chief stepped back, his professional demeanor returning. Sergeant Turner will escort you back to the station. I expect that report on my desk within the hour. He turned to leave, then paused. And Morrison? The next time you reach for your holster during a routine traffic stop, you better have a damn good reason that doesn't have anything to do with the driver's skin color. The incident report sat in the center of Chief Anderson's desk like a live grenade. 3 days had passed since the traffic stop, and the ripples were still spreading through the department. Morrison's write-up was clinically detailed, attempting to justify each decision with procedure and protocol. But the body camera footage told a different story, one that had the entire command staff shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they reviewed it. He's got a clean disciplinary record, Captain Reynolds argued, though his heart didn't seem in it. 8 years of service. 8 years of this, Chief Anderson interrupted, spreading out the statistical analysis he'd been compiling. Look at the patterns, Ted. Morrison isn't an outlier. He's a symptom. The chief had spent the last 2 nights in his office, expanding his review beyond Morrison's stops to the entire department. The data painted a damning picture, one that could no longer be explained away by demographics or crime statistics. Dr. Anderson had declined to file a formal complaint, but her words to her husband the night of the incident echoed in his mind. It's not about punishing one officer, Robert. It's about fixing a system that made him think this was acceptable. The command staff meeting that morning was the longest in department history. By the end, even the old guard had fallen silent in the face of the evidence. The chief's proposal sat before them, a complete overhaul of training, supervision, and accountability measures. Morrison's administrative leave becomes indefinite suspension, pending review, the chief announced, his tone brooking no argument. But this goes beyond one officer. Starting next week, every member of this department, including everyone in this room, will undergo extensive bias recognition and de-escalation training. We're implementing civilian oversight of traffic stop reviews. Body camera footage will be randomly audited by an independent committee. He paused, looking each commander in the eye. And for those thinking this is an overreaction to a personal incident, Dr. Anderson has agreed to chair our new Community Relations Board. She'll be working with other citizens who've had similar experiences. The only difference is, they didn't have a direct line to the chief of police. The room was silent as the implications sank in. Years of denied problems, dismissed complaints, and defended statistics were about to be dragged into the light. One more thing, the chief added, his voice softer but no less firm. My wife asked me something the night of the incident. She asked how many other doctors, lawyers, teachers, how many other people in our community have changed their routes home, changed their cars, changed their clothes, trying to avoid what happened to her. I didn't have an answer. He stood, gathering his files. But I promise you this, by the time we're done, that number will be 0. As the command staff filed out, Captain Reynolds lingered. Chief, the union's going to push back hard on some of this. Let them. The chief's voice was weary but determined. We can handle union negotiations. What we can't handle is losing the trust of the people we're sworn to protect. I saw my wife's face in that body camera footage, Ted. She wasn't surprised. She was resigned. Like she expected it. He shook his head. That's not fear of one bad officer. That's fear of a broken system. And we're going to fix it, whether the union likes it or not. Morrison sat in his living room, staring at the suspension notice on his coffee table. 2 weeks had passed since the traffic stop, and the enforced leave had given him too much time to think. His body camera footage had become required viewing in the department's new training sessions, a case study in how implicit bias escalates into dangerous behavior. The knock on his door was unexpected. Through the peephole, he saw Dr. Anderson standing on his porch, still in her hospital scrubs. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the door. "Dr. Anderson, Save it," she said, not unkindly. "I'm here because the department's review board is meeting tomorrow to decide your future. As chair of the Community Relations Board, I'll be there. I thought you deserved to know what I'm going to say." He stood aside to let her in, noting how different she looked in the daylight, away from the tension of that rainy night. She took a seat without waiting for an invitation. "I've reviewed your entire record," she began. "Every traffic stop. Every interaction. The pattern is clear, but so is something else. You've never had excessive force complaint. You've never discharged your weapon. Your problem isn't aggression, it's fear disguised as authority." Morrison sank into the chair across from her. "I never thought of myself as racist," she finished. "Few do. But bias isn't always about hatred. Sometimes it's about assumptions so deeply ingrained we don't even recognize them." She leaned forward. "Tell me, Officer Morrison, what did you see when you ran my plates that night?" He swallowed hard. "A vehicle that seemed out of place." "No," she interrupted. "The truth. What did you really see?" The silence stretched between them until something inside Morrison finally broke. "I saw what I expected to see," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I never questioned why I expected it." Dr. Anderson nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, I'm going to recommend that you be given a choice. Resignation, or a path back to the force that includes extensive retraining, community service, and a permanent assignment to our new community outreach unit." She stood. "The choice will be yours, but know this, if you choose to stay, you'll be working directly with the communities you've profiled. You'll learn their stories, their fears, their humanity. And you'll do it under my supervision." Morrison looked up, surprised. "You be willing to work with me? After what happened?" "This isn't about forgiveness, Officer Morrison. It's about change. Real change. The kind that happens when we confront our biases instead of denying them." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The chief told me about your rookie year, how you wanted to make a difference in the community. That officer is still in there somewhere. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to find him again?" After she left, Morrison sat in silence for a long time. On his TV screen, the local news was running another story about the department's sweeping reforms. He saw footage of Chief Anderson announcing new transparency measures, of community meetings where citizens shared their experiences with law enforcement. Finally, he reached for his phone and began to type an email to the review board. He knew what his choice would be. It wouldn't be easy, and some would say he didn't deserve the chance. But as Dr. Anderson had said, this wasn't about forgiveness, it was about change. And change, he was beginning to understand, had to start from within. 1 year later, Officer James Morrison stood before a classroom of new recruits at the police academy. The faces looking back at him were diverse, a visual testament to the department's reformed recruitment policies. On the wall behind him, a photograph showed him standing alongside Dr. Anderson at the opening of the department's first Community Engagement Center. "Some of you might recognize me from your training materials," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I'm the officer from that body camera footage you watched yesterday. The one who let bias cloud his judgment and nearly destroyed his career because of it." In the back of the room, Chief Anderson and Dr. Anderson sat quietly observing. This had become a regular part of the department's enhanced training program, real stories, real consequences, real change. "But that's not why I'm here today," Morrison continued. I'm here because what happened that night didn't just change my career, it transformed our entire department. And more importantly, it changed me. He clicked to a slide showing the department's latest statistics. Traffic stop disparities down by 60%, civilian complaints reduced by 45%, community trust metrics at their highest levels in department history. But it was the less quantifiable changes that meant the most: the growing number of officers volunteering for community outreach, the youth mentorship programs, the regular dialogue sessions with neighborhood leaders. Dr. Anderson could have ended my career that night, Morrison said, glancing at her. Instead, she chose to be part of the solution. She taught me that true justice isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about recognizing the humanity in every person we serve. The Community Relations Board, under Dr. Anderson's leadership, had become a model for other departments across the state. Morrison's story was now a case study in police academies nationwide, not just as a warning, but as proof that meaningful change was possible. "You're about to put on this badge," Morrison concluded, touching his own. "It's not just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of trust. And trust, once broken, takes more than policies and procedures to rebuild. It takes acknowledgement, accountability, and action." After the session, Chief Anderson joined his wife and Morrison in the hallway. "The governor's office called," he said. "They want to use our reform model statewide." Dr. Anderson smiled, the same quiet strength evident in her expression that she'd shown that rainy night a year ago. It's amazing how one moment of confronting truth can ripple out to create such change. Morrison nodded, thinking of all the lives touched by what had happened, including his own. "Sometimes," he said, "it takes seeing ourselves through someone else's eyes to really understand who we are, and who we need to become. The truth is, change begins with recognition, the willingness to confront our own biases and assumptions. But it doesn't end there. Real transformation happens when we choose to act on that recognition, when we decide that doing better isn't just an option, but a responsibility." This story reminds us that in the journey toward justice and equality, every interaction matters. Every decision has the power to either reinforce old prejudices or build new understanding. The choice, as always, is ours to make. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps spread these important messages and continues the conversation about positive change in our communities. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how we can all work together to create a more just and equitable society. How has this story changed your perspective on bias and accountability? Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on more powerful stories that challenge us to think differently and act better. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.